Sometimes the most revealing moments happen when nobody expects them. No press release. No dramatic sit-down interview. Just a Thursday morning on live television, a guest host asking one simple question, and a man who has spent decades keeping his marriage mostly private suddenly saying something that stopped a lot of viewers in their tracks. It happened during the August 7th episode of Live, with Carrie Coon sitting in as guest host while Kelly Ripa recovers at home from surgery. Mark Consuelos was flying solo behind the desk, and somewhere in the middle of the usual morning banter, the conversation drifted somewhere unexpectedly personal. Carrie asked him why at one point he and Kelly had spent so long apart. And Mark answered honestly. He told her that during the pandemic he was only able to see his wife for 19 days across 10 months. 19 days. Out of roughly 300. Sit with that number for a second because it doesn't match the image most of us carry of this couple. We know Kelly and Mark as the pair who show up to work together every single morning, who bicker affectionately on camera, who seem almost incapable of being apart for more than a segment break. So hearing that there was a stretch of their marriage where they barely saw each other at all, that's the kind of detail that makes you sit up a little straighter. Mark explained that he'd been working in Canada at the time, and Carrie immediately understood what that meant. You were in the strict protocols, she said, referring to the intensely regulated production bubbles that Canada put in place so film and television work could continue safely during COVID lockdowns. And she added something simple but true, that was a scary time. It was. For everyone. But there's something different about hearing that fear described from inside a marriage that so many people feel like they already know. Here's why this moment matters more than it might seem on the surface. We don't usually think about celebrity marriages surviving the same isolation that ordinary people went through. There's a tendency to assume that fame insulates people from the hardest parts of life, that somehow money and access mean the pandemic hit differently for them. But what Mark described was achingly familiar to anyone who spent 2020 and 2021 separated from a spouse, a partner, a parent, because of work, because of borders, because the world had simply stopped functioning the way it used to. 10 months. 19 days together. That's not a celebrity story. That's a story a lot of viewers live themselves, just with different jobs and different zip codes. That's probably why the moment landed the way it did. It wasn't shocking because it was scandalous. It was shocking because it was relatable in a way we don't usually get from two people who've spent over a decade building a brand around effortless chemistry. And then came the detail that turned a heavy admission into something warmer, something almost funny in the way real marriages are funny. Mark said that when he finally made it home after all those months apart, he discovered his wife had made a change to their bedroom. My side of the bed, he said. She had taken my side of the bed. Carrie Coon, without missing a beat, suggested there might be something sort of sweet buried in that detail. And honestly, she's right. Think about what that small, almost throwaway line is actually telling us. Kelly didn't just miss her husband in some abstract, sentimental way. She missed him physically in the architecture of their daily life, enough that she gravitated toward his side of the bed while he was gone. It's not a grand romantic gesture. It's not something either of them probably planned to share on national television. It's the kind of quiet, involuntary habit that happens when absence actually hurts, when your body adjusts to someone's absence in ways you don't consciously choose. And that's the thing about long marriages that people rarely get to see from the outside. The big declarations, the anniversary tributes, the red carpet photos, those are curated. But taking someone's side of the bed because you can't sleep comfortably without some version of them nearby? That's not curated. That's just what missing someone actually looks like when the cameras aren't rolling and there's no script. It's worth pausing here to talk about why Mark shared this at all. He's not a man who typically volunteers the harder chapters of his marriage on air. Most of what viewers get from him is warmth, humor, a little bit of teasing, the occasional shirtless photo joke at his own expense. But there's a version of vulnerability that only surfaces when someone is asked directly, without warning, in the middle of a conversation they didn't plan for. Carrie's question wasn't confrontational. It was curious. And Mark, instead of deflecting into a joke the way so many public figures might, just told the truth. He described a scary time. He described missing his wife. He described coming home to a small, physical reminder of that absence. That's a choice. Even in a low-key moment on a morning talk show, choosing honesty over deflection says something about a person. There's also something worth exploring in the timing of when this story resurfaced. Mark shared it while Kelly herself was absent, this time not because of a pandemic, but because of a gum graft surgery, a procedure her dentist had actually recommended 5 years earlier. Kelly had joked back then that she didn't expect to still be on the air 5 years later, which, in hindsight, is the kind of comment that only sounds funny because it turned out to be wrong. She's still there. still co-hosting. Still, apparently, still capable of making her husband miss her enough that talking about a years-old pandemic separation still catches in his voice a little. So in a strange way, this wasn't really a story about the pandemic at all. It was a story about absence in general, how this couple has now had to navigate more than one version of it. First, the involuntary kind, forced on them by lockdowns and border restrictions and a virus nobody understood yet. And now a smaller, more manageable kind, where Kelly is simply recovering from a scheduled procedure and will be back at the desk by September. Different stakes, same underlying dynamic. Two people who have built their entire public identity around being together, forced once again to sit with what it feels like to not be. Maybe that's part of why viewers keep gravitating toward these small, unscripted confessions instead of the big staged interviews. Anyone can talk about love in the abstract. It's much harder to talk about the specific, slightly embarrassing detail of a spouse quietly annexing your side of the mattress while you're stuck behind strict pandemic protocols in another country. That specificity is what makes it feel true. Audiences have gotten remarkably good at detecting the difference between a rehearsed sentiment and a real one, and this moment read as unmistakably real. There's also something to be said about how differently this story would have landed coming from almost any other celebrity couple. Because Kelly and Mark have spent years cultivating an image of near-constant togetherness, the matching morning show desk, the joint red carpet appearances, the running jokes about still being attracted to each other after 3 decades. Hearing about a period of genuine separation actually deepens the story rather than undercutting it. It reminds viewers that the ease we see on screen every morning wasn't inevitable. It was built, in part, by surviving stretches where being together wasn't an option at all. It's easy to watch two people who seem effortlessly connected and assume that connection has never been tested. What Mark's confession does, whether he intended it to or not, is quietly correct that assumption. It suggests that some of the warmth audiences see now might be, at least in part, a product of having once gone without it. 19 days over 10 months has a way of teaching two people exactly how much they don't want to repeat that experience. Whether or not viewers consciously register all of this while watching a few minutes of morning television, something about it clearly resonates. That's why a moment like this doesn't just get reported once and forgotten. It gets replayed, discussed, clipped, and talked about days later because it touches something a lot of people quietly understand from their own lives during that same stretch of time. Perhaps the reason so many people remain invested in Kelly and Mark isn't simply because they've spent decades in the spotlight together. It's because every so often, in the middle of an ordinary Thursday morning, one of them says something unscripted enough to remind us that the spotlight was never the point. The marriage was. So here's the real question worth sitting with. Was it the number, 19 days over 10 months, that stayed with you? Or was it the smaller detail, the side of the bed, the quiet proof that absence changes people even when they don't mean it to? Share which part hit you hardest, and if you've ever lived through a version of that same forced distance during those pandemic years, you're probably not alone in feeling something familiar in this one.